Today I will be discussing a library lesson created for a group of 6th graders who have previously viewed my Copyright and You presentation. This lesson is going to be a copyright and public domain collage, and it was designed using the Assure model. The Assure model is a way to design lessons that focuses on 6 different categories. I like having the 6 categories up around me while I'm designing a lesson to make sure I'm not missing anything as I go through. The first and most important step of designing a lesson with the Assure model is analyzing the learners. So this class that's going to be coming to visit me in the library is a group of 26 students, 1 teacher. There are 14 males, 12 females, various different backgrounds and ethnicities. Their learner profile kind of breaks down. About 50% of the class are average on grade level proficiency and ability. 30% are below grade level and have different IEPs. 20% are above grade level and have some advanced ability. Other information I like to consider is how many of the students are English language learners, at risk, or economically disadvantaged. Just there are other things I may need to differentiate in the lessons, whether it's simplified instructions for my ELLs, or maybe some extra encouragement for some of my at-risk students that may not necessarily be at present and focused on the lesson that I'm giving. Learning styles, really the most common preferred learning styles of this class are visual, 50%, and kinesthetic, 40%. 10% have said that auditory is their preferred learning style. So when designing a lesson, I try to include as much as possible from all 3 to have a little something for everybody. Another thing for me to consider when I was designing this lesson was the prior knowledge, entry characteristics that these students were going to be coming to me with. They do know how to navigate the internet generally. They can create and save Word documents. They know how to respond via written or verbal communication. That ranges from below to on to above grade level proficiency. They do have some skills in the use of computers and tablets. However, this is geared more towards social media and entertainment applications rather than word processing, formulas, or creating with Google Slides or PowerPoint. They have had some experience with researching materials and using citations, so today when we talk about citations, it won't be a new concept, just a bit of a refresher. The state standards we're going to be covering in this lesson today, the English Language Arts Grade 6 standards, identify and gather relevant information from a variety of sources, and differentiate between paraphrasing and plagiarism when using source materials. Since we're gathering materials for a collage, we will be using a bunch of different sources, and since some of those are copyrighted, it's important that they do know how to paraphrase or know how to properly cite to where as not to commit plagiarism. Some technology applications and TEKS we're going to be covering today, understanding copyright principles, open source, public domain, those type of things that they'll need for this project, as well as they will practice ethical acquisition of information and standards for citing sources, as we stated a little bit earlier. The AASL standards that'll be covered are seeking a variety of sources and systematically questioning and assessing the validity and accuracy of the information to make sure they're getting it from a correct source, which they'll be using bookmark sources from the library website. So I know that they're authentic, but it's still good for them to consider this, and when I'm going around asking questions, I'm going to ask them about this because it's something they need to be thinking about. The overall learning objectives that I'm looking for is to review the copyright presentation that they were sent out, my Copyright and You presentation. The pairs of 6th graders are going to be working together to design a collage of visuals and text from both copyrighted and public domain sources. I'd like for them to use 3 copyrighted sources and 4 public domain sources to get a mix. And I don't want them to spend a whole lot of time doing citations. They'll be using their Chromebooks and Google Slides for this. Students will present their collages and explain where they found their sources and explain if they were copyrighted materials or public domain. And they will correctly cite their copyrighted information that they use. As I said, I'm going to be going around throughout this lesson as well, and we'll be asking questions. Can I tell a difference between copyrighted and public domain materials? Just because that's an important differentiation to make. But that is the state objectives part of the Assure model. The next part of the Assure model is to select the methods, media, materials to use for the lesson. For this lesson, the methods I'm going to use are interactive instruction. They're going to discuss the learning objectives with me. They're going to do a quick post-it review activity based on the lesson I sent out before. That's going to be the auditory part of the lesson. This is also where we're going to go through the rubric, and I'm going to break down what I'm looking for in their collages. The project-based part of this will be creating the collage in Google Slides with their partner, and that's going to be the visual learning style. For active learning, they're going to be actually using their Chromebooks with their partners to search for images and text that they want to use. They're going to be using their own Chromebooks because they're using Google Slides. They can create and work on the same Google slide together, which is what they'll be doing. But they're both going to be active, and that's the more kinesthetic style of learning. The materials that we'll need for this, an overhead projector and computer for me, my Copyright NU PowerPoint, so we can go over it briefly, specifically the parts on what copyright is and what public domain is, Post-it notes for our quick review activity, Google Chromebooks for them, a collage example that I created in order to show them what I'm looking for, and examples of picture and text citations to have at their table, so when they do find their source, it's kind of a quick refresher on how to cite that properly, and then rubrics for them to take a look at as well. The next part of the Assure model is the U, Utilized Methods, Media, and Materials. And here's how I'll be doing all of that. First, I'm going to preview several sources for the collage and set up a list on the library website under my bookmark section. So I will give them set sites to go and visit to kind of streamline the process so it doesn't take as long. I'm going to need to create a collage example and examples of picture and text citations for them to use, as well as make sure their Chromebooks are on and working when they come into the library to do this lesson. In order to prepare the environment for the students, I'm going to set up the tables where there are 4 students per table. The lights will be on because they can still see the projector and they're less likely to zone out when the lights are on, I have found. Initially, the chairs will all be facing towards the projector screen so they can see the review that we're going to go through and see the examples of the rubric and all that stuff. Then we will turn and they'll face towards the middle of the table. To prepare my learners, I'm going to make sure first that they have access to my Copyright NU presentation well before they come to the library, so they have that background knowledge as they enter in. It had some great information in it, and they're going to need that for today's lesson. But I'll also do some quick questions once they're there in our review process and have them share out some examples of their own copyrighted work so they get an idea that really anything is copyrighted if it's an original idea that someone has. And for providing the experiences of the lesson, that'll obviously be here in just a second in the instructional plan. So the R in the Assure model is require learner participation. And this is how my learners will be participating. We're going to start with the large group activities, that initial review. I'm going to introduce the lesson and objectives. I'm going to review the Copyright NU flipped lesson very, very briefly with the Post-it note responses from students, asking their definitions or their thoughts on a couple of things. I'm going to introduce and explain the citation examples to access their prior knowledge. Like I said, this is something that they have already had experience with. I just want to draw that forth so it doesn't seem like a foreign concept when they're working. Then I'm going to show them my example of the collage, explain how I chose my pieces, and then so they get an idea of what to look at. Then I'm going to introduce the rubric and tell them exactly what I'm looking for and how it's going to be graded. Obviously, I want the 3 copyrighted materials, 4 public domain materials to be used in this collage. I would like for them to be able to explain the difference between the 2, and I'd like for them to be able to cite things properly, and I'm going to go over that with them. Then I'm going to ask them some leading questions about copyrighted materials and public domain materials to see if they understand it and see if they're in a good place to get started on their independent practice. They will be working independently and with their partners, but independent from me. They're going to use their Chromebooks to access the internet and library website bookmark page to start locating materials for their collage. These are visuals and text that they find interesting. Students will use Google Slides to arrange these materials in a way that's pleasing to them. They're going to use citation examples provided to properly cite their copyrighted visuals or text. And then they're going to present to everyone their collage and explain where they found each piece and whether or not it's a copyrighted material or public domain material. And for the final activity, their exit ticket basically out the doors, they're going to write a very brief explanation to me, the difference between copyrighted and public domain materials, and if they can, give me some examples. This lesson is designed to take an entire class period in the library, so a whole chunk, about 45 minutes. So there is a lot of time to work on this, but I will be walking around monitoring to make sure that they're staying on task in order to make the best use of our time. For my students that require differentiated learning, my IEP students, they will receive all of the accommodations listed in their IEP. Some of them need extended time if that's necessary. I do have a couple of templates, things that they can look at. The main one that I would probably use for my IEP students in this class is reducing the assignment to maybe 2 copyrighted materials and 3 public domain materials, or less if I need to, depending on the time frame that we have. And also scribing, someone that can help type things out or help them talk through their ideas. And that could be with a buddy, a partner as listed in their IEP, or that can be with me if needed, or our library aide. I will be moving around the room to facilitate as needed, answering questions and helping students find and use materials as we go through. And finally, the E part of the Assure model is to evaluate and revise. Students their performance will be evaluated by the rubric. Did they accomplish what I asked them to? Are they able to explain the difference between copyrighted and public domain materials? And that that rubric is attached with the rest of the lesson. And it's always important to evaluate the students, but it's just as important for us to evaluate ourselves as instructors. And so at the end of the lesson, I will discuss with the students what they enjoyed or did not enjoy about the lesson, and if they have any ideas to improve it for the next class that comes through or next year for the next grade level to do this lesson. Their input and their feedback are essential to creating well-crafted and meaningful lessons, and it definitely helps them get some more ownership in their learning experience when they feel like their opinion matters. So that is how I have designed my lesson, this copyrighted materials, public domain materials collage, using the Assure model.